Ladies and gentlemen, up next, we are going to be getting into Nagios XI Under the Hood with Trevor McDonald. Trevor is the support manager here with Nagios. Thank you for attending, and we will have 10 minutes at the end to go over any questions or comments that you guys might have. But without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Trevor.
Cool. Thank you, Emmett. All right. So, Nagios XI Under the Hood. My name's Trevor. I've been with Nagios for about 2 years now. And you can find me on the support forum. My name's T. McDonald. Last year I did a talk on a project called Nagduino. It was in a room about the size of one of those screens, so this is very different. Very different for me. It's just a little Arduino library that allows you to talk back to Nagios, and that was a really fun talk. So I threw that up on GitHub. You can find the code there under my account. Not really work-related. Some of the things I love are world languages. You guys have probably heard me speaking more Spanish than English this year. I love languages. If you speak another language, I'd love to talk to you and learn more about it. And then security, too. Big into computer security. Myself and Jesse Olson, after the conference, we're going to start some security training and hopefully get certified. So we'll find out in 3 months if we pass. No pressure. I'm still not Iron Man, Eric. I'm still not Iron Man. Yeah. So now on to the part that people will skip to once this is on YouTube. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about what goes on under the hood in XI. You run a check, you get a notification, but there's a lot of parts in between there that aren't really obvious if you haven't really dived deep into it. So what's in scope is I'm going to assume that everyone's going to go home and get XI5 right away. So what's in scope is XI5. Running Nagios Core 4.1.1 with NDO mod in use and bulk mode for perf data processing. If you don't understand what all those things mean, it'll become apparent during the talk. But what is not in scope, but still for the most part pretty valid, XI versions before 2014, there were some changes, particularly between 2012 and 2014. Same goes with Core 4, 3.5 to Core 4. There were some big changes. And I'm not going to go into like mod gearman or DNX or any other remote agents. We're going to keep this as a pretty vanilla set of checks. Runs on the Nagios machine, active check, comes back, notifications, things like that. So mostly I'm going to be talking about files and processes today. So for the files, it's mostly flat files like log files. You can read it with a text editor. It's human text. The RRD files, it stands for round robin database. It's actually a really cool concept. It's essentially a standard like fixed size file. You start writing at the top, and then when you get to the bottom, you just loop back up to the top again. So you do lose some data after some time, but we do some cool tricks to average out the data so that you can store 3 years worth of data. MySQL, of course, is a database backend. If you've looked at the core config manager at all, that's what is used in the backend is MySQL. And then Postgres and Sorta. So new installs of Nagios XI 5 only will use Postgres or MySQL. We've moved away from using Postgres. However, an upgrade from a 2014 version to XI5 will not automatically go to MySQL. We're going to have some migration scripts. Talk to the developers about that. I don't want to overpromise anything, but we're moving away from Postgres. Then in terms of processes, kind of in rough order, we have obviously, Nagios, you may have heard of it. NDO to DB. NDO stands for, I believe, Nagios Data Out or Nagios Data Objects. I've never actually gotten confirmation on that. Essentially, it's a little broker module that allows you to store information from your Nagios system as it's running into a MySQL database. And we use that a lot for reports and things in the GUI. Cron, everybody knows Cron. Run something every minute or every day or every third Saturday. And then NPCD, which is the Nagios Perf Data C daemon. It's used a lot very heavily in actually processing the check data. We'll go into those a little bit more later on. So just kind of a general overview of what happens and what we're going to cover. So a check is run. It could be a DNS check. It could be a simple ping. It could be something really complicated like a Java heap memory stack something. Doesn't matter. The check is run. you typically will get 3 pieces of data. At the very least, you need an exit code. 0 is okay, 1 is warning, 2 is critical, 3 is unknown, things like that. And then status output, which is like the human readable string that gets returned, and you look at it in the email and in the reports. Optionally, off of that status output, you can have performance data, and we'll go into more of the format of that later. And then the check is run, and you have event handlers, if needed, can get launched, and you get notifications. So kind of simultaneously to that, once the check is run and while the event handlers and notifications are being handled, you have the performance data goes through this multi-step process of being processed. So there's a couple of pieces that hit it, and I kind of want to focus on those today because that's one of the biggest questions we have is, what are all these directories? What are all these files? Why do we have cron running, and what is NPCD? And reports, web GUI, et cetera, that's kind of the final destination. So once everything is run, it's been stored away, you look at it. True story, so this is actually the CPU load for my workstation. You'll notice I never leave the office, ever. And I'm apparently most productive at 5 a.m. So thank you. So I've built this little diagram here. And don't worry about memorizing this right now. Go ahead, take your pictures. I will have it up at the end. These slides will be going up on SlideShare after the conference. But essentially, this is kind of a little diagram of the workflow from the check being run, and all the stuff on the right is the performance data. I'm gonna skip over this in just a bit because we'll have, you'll see. 2 things I want to point out is whenever you see .. that is a shortcut saying user, local, Nagios, because I didn't want to write that whole thing out and make the graph really big. And then whenever you see $time t $, that's just the current Unix timestamp whenever whatever was run. So if you look in the top left-hand corner, I've made a little mini map. So the red, if you can remember back to the diagram, which was here, the red is what step we're currently on, or what directory if we're talking about performance data. And that'll update with each slide so you can kind of have an idea visually of where we are. So the first thing we're going to talk about, and this is mostly an XI talk, but since XI uses core under the hood, you kind of have to talk about core. So a check is run. Now what does that mean? In a status.dat file, which is just one of the files that's updated fairly regularly, you have the next check time for each of your hosts and services. So when that gets hit, you run a check. And basically, this is the code. Now, I have to apologize to any C developers who are watching this. This is like 90% real code. This would not compile. I had to shorten it down. The actual thing is like 2 lines long. Essentially, there's a function in C called execvp. You pass it in the plugin name, and it runs the binary, and you pass in the arguments. This is where the magic happens, right? This is what actually launches off that binary plugin or Perl or what have you. And then you get the results are reaped and passed along, and they kind of look like this, right? So this is just a standard ping check. So the part that says ping OK, packet loss is 0%, RTA, that part is the status output. That is what you would see in the web interface. For example, if you go to status details, you'll notice 0.40 milliseconds. I thought that was a little low. I actually tested that. That was the real value, 0.40 milliseconds. That was ridiculously low. But then off to the far right on that first line, you see that little pipe character. Everything after that is the performance data. We'll go a little bit more into that later, but I just want to make sure that everyone's seen an actual check as it would be run like on the command line. So the big multi-step process here. So the results are processed. Well, what does that mean? So you get 3 pieces of information. Arguably the most critical and the only one that's actually required. If you saw Janice Singh's talk on how to write a custom plugin, she talked about the exit code. 0 for OK, 2 for critical, etc. That's the only part that's actually required. That's what tells Nagios, hey, there's a problem. Hey, everything's OK. We need to notify. Nothing's on fire. The status output, again, is everything that a human would read. It's really arbitrary. It can contain anything, but it's most useful if it's, useful. And then anything after the pipe character is the performance data. And not a whole lot in terms of processing is done with the exit code and the status output. They're kind of just stashed and then retrieved later. So, if we do a talk on Nagios core under the hood, we might talk a little bit more about that. But from an XI standpoint, mostly it's performance data. So We'll just touch on this really quick. They go multiple places: status.dat, retention.dat, nagios.log if it's a non-OK check. syslog is optional. Basically, it's just a copy of what's in nagios.log. And then the NDO database. Now, I say it's optional with a little asterisk. It is truly optional, but a lot of XI is going to break if you don't have NDO. A lot of the reports aren't going to be able to reach out to that MySQL database and grab that information, so you can't run reports. So keep NDO enabled. But in core, it is basically truly optional. So now the interesting part, we've moved on to performance data. So it's got a standardized format. And you saw the whole check later, but we're gonna just kind of cut it down to just the relevant bits. So it's handled by Nagios, and then cron, and then NPCD. And we're gonna touch on all of those individually, but in that order. It also goes many places, just like the exit code and the status output, flat files, databases, XML, RD files. So kind of looks like this. This is our generic format for what performance data is. So you have a label. For example, temperature, right? Temperature equals 70. Or if you're using Celsius, like what, 21? I don't know. So you have a label equals value, and then the UOM, it's in brackets because it's optional. It says unit of measure. So it could be a percentage, it could be a number of bytes, it could be a decimal. There's a couple different values there. Then you have warn, crit, min, and max, pretty obvious. Warning and critical thresholds. And then the minimum and maximum is kind of it can be used in graphing to say, okay, this is the highest it should ever go. We don't need to graph any higher, and minimum, we don't need to go any lower. So this is the output for our standard ping check, right? The example I showed you earlier, saying RTA is the label, equals value, which is 0.401000 ms. And then semicolon, 400.000, semicolon, 800.000. That is the warning and critical values for milliseconds, because this is a ping check. We want to warn if it is 400 milliseconds or higher, and we want to go critical if it's 800 or higher. And this is, again, used in graphing. So we can draw in XI5, you'll notice in some of the high charts graphs, and high charts is just the JavaScript library that we use to build these graphs. You'll notice that you can set the warning and the critical lines. So you can say, okay, yep, here's where it peaked. It was warning but not critical, and then it went critical, then it was okay. And in this example, we have a minimum, but we don't have a maximum. I don't know why. The minimum is 0. If you can manage to get a ping out in negative seconds, please contact me. And the NASA will probably contact you. And the same is for packet loss. So PL equals 0%, right? We've got no packet loss, which is good. We want to warn if we have 40% packet loss, and we want to go critical if we have 80%. Pretty standard. So kind of broken down, it looks like this. Label, value, warns, crit, min, max. So the first thing that touches all this is Nagios. So we've moved up to the very first directory up there, which is .. which remember again is user local Nagios, or if you were using core, wherever you have it installed. But in XI, it's user local Nagios, var, and then I say slash, bracket, host pipe service. That's saying if it's a host, it will go in host-perf data. If it's a service, it'll go in service-perf data. So whenever you see that, I use that a lot in my slides, again, just to kind of save some space. So it will go in two places depending on what type of perf data it is. There's a directive in nagios.cfg called, again, host or service perf data file template that defines what macros go where? Where do you have a tab? Do you have any new lines? Are there any single quotes or anything? So it'll pull that and write it out to a file. And then every 15 seconds by default, and that's defined in the, again, host or service, perf data file processing interval, it will run the command that is defined in host or service, perf data file processing command. And that command looks like this. It's called process, host or service, perf data file bulk, and essentially it's just this one command. It moves from var host or service perf data into var spool xidpe $t, which again is that Unix macro, dot perf data dot host or service. The reason we split it out is because services are going to have a little bit more information than a host, because the service perf data has to include the host name, whereas a host perf data result doesn't need to include the service name, because it just doesn't have one. So the next one is cron. Cron comes up and it runs this every minute. User local Nagios XI cron perfdataproc.php. Now it's run every minute, but only kinda. It actually stays alive for 55 seconds, and then it exits out. So during that 55 seconds, it's constantly in a loop, processing the performance data and doing some other things. It also handles the outbound transfers, if you've ever used that, if you have like a distributed setup. This is kind of what hooks into and processes that. So move the files into ... /var spool perf data. Right? And then NPCD takes over. NPCD is what does the actual work. So at this point, we've basically just kind of moved the file around a few times. NPCD does the real legwork. Again, every 15 seconds by default, it will run the following command. User local Nagios libexec /processperfdata.pl. It's a Perl file. And it processes the files. So it actually grabs all the information and sets them into two files. Under user local Nagios, share perf data, and then it creates a directory with the host name. So if it's a localhost check, it would be called localhost. If it's called www.nagios.com, it would be a file called, or a folder called www.nagios.com. And then within that, it creates all of the service files. So you get two files for each service that has perf data. They're named identically after the service description, and one of them is an RRD file, which again is the round-robin database. It starts at the top, comes to the bottom, does some averaging. And then there's an XML file, which has basically information about that RRD file. And then you get really cool things like this. Now at this point, for the photographers in the room, I like to pause on a screen that looks really cool so I can do things like this, like these action poses. So take your pictures now. Okay. I call this one explaining something. I'm going to do another one I call synergy, right? Corporate synergy. We got that, right? Right? Okay, okay. And then I say, like, you get it, like the Enlightenment. That's the most ridiculous thing I've done, and I showed up in a kilt yesterday. All right, so the performance data is basically done at that point. It's stored in the RRD. It gets picked up all over the place. I wanted to talk a little bit about the event handlers and the notifications, right? So that's another big part of this. That's almost entirely handled by core. XI doesn't really do a whole lot more with the event handlers. If you've used core at all, if you've used even XI and you've done event handlers, that's like 95% of that is in core. Notifications, again, kicked off by core. XI modifies them a little bit, so I'll be talking a little bit more about those. But it's all standard Nagios logic. Event handlers run on every state change. So if a check is okay for 10 minutes and then becomes a warning or a critical, you'll have an event handler run. An event handler is basically just a script. It can be Perl, Bash, Python, whatever. That can be used to kind of react in an automated fashion to certain events. So let's say you're monitoring a web server and it says critical, the web server is not running. You can have an event handler, which could just be like a bash script, that's going to log into that remote machine through SSH, run service HTTPD restart, and then next time it checks, it's okay, right? So they're very powerful, entirely handled in core. I say they only take action for certain states because the script is whatever you want it to be. There's no point for you to necessarily restart the Apache service if it's only a warning, right? So if it's just a slow response, you don't need to restart it, but if it's a critical, you do. So you can kind of build that into your script however you'd like. And then notifications after the max check attempts value, let's say you have it set to 5, you've checked it 5 times, it's been critical 5 times in a row, the notification logic kicks in. So the notification process in XI it's two things. It's complicated, and it is somewhat proprietary. So this is going to be kind of a high-level overview of it. Really, it's not super complicated from a high level, but there are a bunch of little things that happen in the back end that I don't have the time to talk about today. You can certainly ask a developer about. It's just notifications, right? How hard can it be? So you can do a couple things. This is basically you have a contact, right? Everyone's got a contact that has a notification command. So in core, you would have notify host or service by email, and XI, host or service notification handler if you're using XI. Core basically just uses send mail, all right? So it's just, the command is literally just like echo this into send mail and give it a subject. Send mail is kind of good for internal office use, but if you're trying to use send mail to send to like a Gmail account, probably isn't going to be picked up. And the reason is send mail is very, very easy to set up. It does not require authentication, so spammers love to use send mail. So anything that's not SMTP authenticated, pretty good chance it's going to get picked up by a spam filter, right? Or blacklist, what have you. XI can do a lot more. So it still uses those core contacts to notify, but it also ties them in with XI users, and I'll go into that in a bit. But just kind of my little sales pitch for XI here in the next 30 seconds. You can use SMTP, so you have the authentication. You can set an importance. You can send over SMS. You can use different methods. So specifically SMTP, it's authenticated. There's some real, you can say, okay, this person is who they say they are. With SendMail, I mean, you can just say, hi, I'm the CEO of Apple. You need to reset your password. Give me your password. And SendMail will send that out, which is why it gets blocked. With SMTP, it's like, okay, you need a password. You can encrypt it, so whoever, if you have your SMTP credentials fairly secure, no one's going to be able to pretend they're you, right? If an email comes from your address and it's through SMTP and standard security policies are followed, reasonably sure it's you. Importance. So in XI, I believe in XI5, we added the ability to mark importance. So if you have a critical alert go out, you can have it set the important flag, which depending on the mail client, will do something. So maybe you open up your mail browser, it might have a big star next to it, it might be highlighted in red or bold or flashing or marquee or whatever. But not all of them have to support that, so that's one little caveat there. SMS, really convenient. Last year I did my talk. I was able to get a text message in my pocket from about 7 seconds after I triggered the event that was supposed to send it, which for a live demo is just terrifying. And then really fast response times with SMS. So you get a text, it's in your pocket. You don't have to open your web browser. You don't have to be by Wi-Fi. You don't have to go to your email, anything. You can get it, you can log in, you can respond. And then when I say methods, I say you can differentiate. I want all the warnings to go to email. I want all the criticals to go to SMS. You can do this in XI. It's probably possible on some level in core, but you'd have to write that logic yourself, right? Like that's not really built in like it is in XI. So notifications in XI, basically it's a big PHP script, calls user bin PHP in user local Nagios XI scripts, handle, Nagios core, notification.php. And there's a ton of arguments. If you've ever looked under the core config manager in XI and you look at the command for this, it's literally like 5 lines worth of hyphen notification type, hyphen address. So these are just 3 of them. There's like 20. It's really cool because you can also configure that. So you can say, okay, I want to add in my own macros. You can really tweak it, and that's a lot harder to do in core. In XI, it's all built in. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So notifications, they pull the user info from the DB, which again was Postgres in pre-XI5, and it's MySQL now, or if you're upgrading, it's kind of dependent. So it pulls all that user info. It grabs like the user address, and if you have any customized templates set up for your notifications, it'll pull that. And that's what I mean is you can format it nicely. There's a nice web page where you can say, I want to have a line of asterisks and then the content and then another line of asterisks, or I want this to be spaced out or this tabbed over. It's really cool. That's saved on a per user basis. Again, possible in core. It's just not, you have to do it from the command line, and some of that logic you have to kind of build in yourself. And it's sent via PHP mailer, which is a PHP-based library. Really robust, great logging, handles SMTP, and again, core doesn't really have that. So finally, we're talking about the reports in the GUI. So you've got all this data, all this performance data, all this status information, all this alert history, and it's stored, and all these reports pull it from various places. So typically, You've got a couple files and a couple database directories. Nagios.log is used by both core and XI to pull information about the state history, timestamps. Was it okay? Was it warning? Was it critical? How okay was it? How warning was it? How critical? And then the archive logs get stored in user local Nagios var archives. And that can be set to rotate daily, weekly, what have you. And then the RD files, of course, ultimately get stored in the share perf data, host name, service description. And then there's some DB tables, just a couple examples here. Nagios underscore acknowledgements, Nagios underscore state history, Nagios underscore notifications. And these are all of the NDO tables. So this is why NDO is so important to use in XI. If you don't have NDO enabled, your reports and your GUI aren't going to be able to contact and reach out and pull data from these tables. And that's basically it. I mean, it's kind of easy for me to come up here in 25 minutes and say, this is what happens. But there's a lot of content I had to kind of remove from this talk because it got either too far into core or it would take 20 minutes to explain the information and then get to the point. So I focus mostly on performance data. Everyone should be able to look at this and understand now, okay, yeah, the check is run and it hits these four directories, and if it's piling up here, I know what's breaking it. I think probably half the people in this room have had their XIDPE directory fill up. Now you know why, right? You know what's happening. You're like, okay, NPCD wasn't running, so that filled up and this couldn't process it, et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to give a couple thanks here, particularly to Scott Wilkerson. He's our lead developer, CTO. He went through and kind of explained, some of the things like the notifications, just some of the stuff that as a user you don't typically see, and as a support person you only see if it breaks, which means it must have been written really well because I wasn't aware of a lot of it. And just some general presentation advice. John Frickson, he's our new C developer. He went into some pretty great detail on the C code, like the exec VP command. Again, I'm so sorry. Any C developer that saw that was going to cringe. I almost left out a semicolon. And then Amy Lohman, she's from our marketing department. She went through everybody's slides and made sure that they all had like the same font and the same size, and they had that really cool blue bar at the bottom that says Nagios that I just don't have the attention span to do. So. Finally, I want to thank everyone else for coming out today. I mean, this is a terrifying, truly terrifying amount of people. It's like 4 times as many as were out there last year. So I always thought I didn't have a problem speaking in front of people, but, that being said, if you've got any questions, I came in actually just under 20 minutes, so it was a little bit faster than I had hoped, but I anticipated questions, so don't leave me hanging. What do you got? Bring it on.
Hey there, very nice presentation, first of all. I'm just curious, why did you dump the Postgres? And a following question, are you using Percona or just plain MySQL from the distribution repository?
So that's a question that I'll probably have you ask the developers proper. However, I think the reason that we're moving away from Postgres is just so that we can have one database instead of 2. We don't have to have 2 separate sets of credentials. Postgres wasn't as easy to offload. So one of the things that we recommend as a performance setting is to offload the MySQL database. For whatever reason, that wasn't as easy to do with Postgres as it was with MySQL. So all in one place, easy to offload, and then just less dependencies. You only need to have MySQL instead of both, so that that's less running on your system. Slight performance increase from not having both. I didn't quite catch the first part of your last question. You said, are we using something instead of MySQL?
Yeah, so there's a fork of MySQL called Percona, which is also open sourced, even though they offer services on top of that, and is slightly better optimized.
Yep, so we're still using MySQL. I believe at this point it's called MariaDB or Mariah, whatever that pronunciation is. I won't offer my opinion on that, but we get everything. So I call it Maria. So I don't think we're using a fork. In terms of optimization, I'm not a database administrator, so I don't want to say yes or no that we have. It's a very highly relational database, NDO, and the core config manager database. If you've ever looked at them, there's like a table for hosts and a table for services, and then another table that links them together, which I've told is good database practice. there's any DBAs that want to just cringe and correct me, please do. But so in terms of actual optimization of the database, like I think the acronym is ACID, like atomicity and stuff like that. I don't know. Talk to Scott, talk to Jake. They could probably answer that a little bit better than I could.
Okay, thank you. One more thing, it's more like a comment. As far as sending emails through core, basically what it does is called a mail utility, which in turn passes along the message to an MTA. And you can then configure that MTA, be it SendMail or Postfix or any others, to relay that onto some SMTP server quite easily. So.
Yeah. So on one of the first slides, I had said, what is in scope is kind of like a standard XI server. The standard install of core, whether you do just like a source install or a yum install, will use SendMail without SMTP. So that can be configured, but it's not really built in. The reason I had mentioned that specifically is because in XI, it's real easy. You put in your credentials and it's there. That was really more of a slight sales pitch than it was an actual technical critique. XI was built for ease of use, whereas core is, mostly command line configuration. And it's possible, it's certainly possible. It's just not baked in by default. You have to kind of tweak some of those settings.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Cool session.
Thank you. Front? Over there? Oh boy, it's Eric.
So, ¿por qué no estás Iron Man ahora?
Dinero. Solamente dinero, yeah. He asked, why am I not Iron Man today? So my joke last year was I had built this little circuit that would monitor if a window was open or a server rack or whatever. And I said, this is my first step to becoming Iron Man. I had promised Eric that I would be Iron Man this year, and I'm not. Next year, of course.
I think it's three things. The max failed attempts, I just want to clarify that when you set it default is 5 times, and let's say your polling interval is 5 minutes, so every 5 minutes it goes there. Does it, what's the interval of the 5 times the max failed attempts?
Okay, so there's a couple pieces in play here, and I can't really illustrate this very well, but there's the check interval, which says I want to check this service every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes or every hour. Then there's the retry interval that says if there's a problem encountered, we want to change that. We want to check more frequently. So if your check interval is 10 minutes, it'll check at 1 o'clock, 1:10, 1:20, for example. And then if there's a problem, like a warning or a critical, you can say I want the retry interval to be 1 minute. So check at 1:21, 1:22, 1:23. And then you have the max checks, or the MAC check attempts, which can be anything. Again, there's no real default. That's, I use 5 as an example. So you can say, I want to check this 5 times, once every minute, before I determine there's a problem. That helps roll out false positives. So it could be like a network temporary issue. Your ping fails. If you alert on that first failure, you're going to be woken up at 3 a.m. for no reason and see it's okay. Does that answer your question? Okay.
And the second is in the SMS, what is the, I wouldn't say the correct, but what is the usual way of using the SMS? Because we've tried in the old days, we subscribed to an SMS server that we registered with a mobile company, or we use SMS to SMTP service with another third party, or we hack a SIM card and use a Raspberry Pi with a USB thing. Mm-hmm. So those 3 work, but what is the most of the should it be proper way?
Yeah, so any of those will work. XI specifically, it uses the SMTP. So you have the phone number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever, and then your carrier.com. So I know for Verizon, it's vtext.com. So you would put, in the US at least, you would put 1 area code, 7-digit number, no hyphens or anything, at vtex.com as if it were an email, and that's how we send it out. And we've got like 14 different carriers in there. We've got like T-Mobile and AT&T and things like that. And it'll let you choose which one you're running, and so it'll send it out properly. But you can use the SMS gateway. So the gateway, it's just a network device that does both traditional TCP-based networking, and it has a little SIM card in there and a big antenna so it can talk to the cell network. We have one of those at work. It's the multi-tech. We have some documentation on how to do that. I like the Raspberry Pi idea. That's basically the same thing, but do-it-yourself solution. So there's a ton of ways to do it. I can't really say there's like an official recommendation, but we use the email format because it's just easiest to set up. You don't have to buy additional software. You don't have to subscribe to anything. The only real downfall is if your carrier doesn't provide that, it's not going to work. It's not going to work.
Can you change the notification messages to be different for a user for the email versus the SMS?
So the question was, because he didn't have the microphone, the question was, can you change the format of the email or the SMS based off of which one it's going to? Yes, in XI you can. So obviously you don't want to have like this 2,000 character thing going to a text message. You want to shorten it out. You want to say, hey, this is the problem. You don't need all the details. You can shorten it out so you can immediately get to that. Does that answer your question? Okay. I saw you raise your hand twice. So I didn't know if you had two questions. That's two thumbs up? Okay. It's a very bright light, so it's very difficult to see.
Just the last question, just quickly, may not be related, but if you have the XI 2014, which is the Postgres, and then if we go to the new one with the MySQL, do we in-place upgrade or do we build a new one and then?
Currently, it's still going to use the Postgres database still. I believe the developers are working on getting a migration script. The user experience in the end is still the same, right? You're basically not going to know or care necessarily what's running in the back end. But that migration script will, I think, be available probably sometime after the conference, unless they've already written it. I don't know. I'd have to ask them on that one.
Excellent. Anyone else, any questions or comments?
So you mentioned the SMS gateway from Multitech. We were notified recently that AT&T is ending 2G service. Yep. So I called up Multitech and asked about their upgrade options, if there was any kind of upgrade path. They did not have a good answer. And so I've talked to a couple of people at Nagios. So what do I do to alleviate having, in my case, two Multitech bricks by the end of next year?
They make great paperweight gifts.
Yeah.
And honestly, I mean, I think I even took your ticket. I remember that one. Yeah, that was me. So I'll repeat my answer here for the sake of everyone else. I mean, that's kind of outside of our realm, right? I mean, we can't really tell Multitech, hey, stop, and then they tell AT&T, hey, stop. That's why we use the email method. It's less prone to deprecation. They can always say, hey, we're going to change our email address format, which did happen once, or they can introduce rate limiting, or they can say, you know what, we're just not going to do the text-to-email thing anymore. That's outside of our control, but that's easier for us to work around than hardware that gets bricked, right? I mean, find another provider, do the Raspberry Pi thing, which honestly is not a very bad idea, right? I mean, that's kind of the new hot thing, and as long as there's cell phones, there will be someone that can make a quick tutorial on how to set one up.
I'm hoping Multitech will come to their senses in the next 3 to 6 months and come up with a new product, but yeah, I'm hoping for something to change.
Yeah, I am too. It's a really cool little box. I mean, there's a lot of features in it. I use it. I've got all of our phone numbers in there in Nagios, so if there's like an emergency or something, we can just text it a message and say, hey, tell everyone. But now we can't do that. So I feel your pain.
Excellent. Any other questions for Trevor? Questions, comments?
I came in like way under time on that. Wow. You could ask more, Eric. I know you could.
Any upcoming projects or anything that you have planned for this year that you'd like to?
For me personally, or for the company?
For your company, yeah.
For the company, I mean, we have the roadmap. Again, I'd probably ask that question more of the developers, because they could not only give you more specifics, but they just have that conversation internal to their team. And we get pulled in when something's confirmed, but I can't really say for sure what is on the roadmap. I know that's the most disappointing answer I could really give. Me personally, I kind of want to explore the use of Core as a robotics platform, but that's a conversation for another year. So.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if nobody else has any other questions, please put your hands together. Oh,
Eric.
we got one more. This might be something else.
Of course, Eric had to wait till everyone clapped.
All right. So you'll get 2 rounds of applause that way. So I do a lot of work in Amazon Web Services, and I've never thought about this until right this very second, especially now that we're getting rid of Postgres. Thank you. Can we run the MySQL portion on a different box?
Yeah, that's totally offloaded.
Can we put it onto a non-MySQL database?
Do you mean like MS SQL?
No, I mean like something in Amazon RDB world.
I would again ask Scott. I would say probably if you really hacked up the code. Are you familiar with like the PDO in PHP? It stands for, I think it's like PHP database object or something like that. It's an abstraction library, so you don't really have to care about the specific language that the database uses. You can just write your SQL and the library will figure out the correct command to run. If we implement that and we do it the right way and we do it 100%, then in theory you could use something other than MySQL, but I don't know if that's in the works. I'd like to see it. I like PDO. It's saved me a lot of development time for my own projects, but
I'll pick on Scott.
You'll pick on Scott?
Yeah.
Thanks. Right. I believe you.
Anyone else?
Okay, now we can.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, once again, Trevor McDonald.